Picture this, we've got a bright and happy Bite Me family here with 4 people working on our games on this YouTube channel, all of that. And tomorrow, unfortunately, everyone except me gets hit by a train. Very weird intro, but hear me out. Recently, there have been some surveys that both we've done with our audience as well as the Godot 2023 community poll that brought to light that over 75% in our case, and I think even 83% in the case of Godot, the developers are solo devs. And this sometimes makes me a bit out of touch, I feel, because I'm spoiled at the end of the day. I have great teammates who are also very talented, and it makes the job of actually making games a lot easier. It's still hard, but I feel like it's still easier than if you do it all on your own. But let's assume that I'm suddenly dumped into the world of solo development. Hopefully not because my teammates get hit by a train, but just, I don't know, what happens. Here's what I would do if I had to shift into solo development after having been working in a team for a while. What would I change? What would stay the same? And how would I just approach this? This is just my plan. It may not be 100% for you, but I think there could still be something valuable in this. The first thing that you need to know is I need to set the stage. What kind of a developer am I? What are my goals and things like that? Because if those things don't match, well, then it probably doesn't make as much sense for you. I am at best a 5 out of 10 programmer. And I'm also not a great artist. So basically, I'm the average indie developer with a dream. And my goal is to make a game and put it on Steam and hope that it at least sells something. So my goal is not to make a 7-year scoped game that is my absolute dream game. I want to see, hey, can I make a game to put my name out there, be like, hey, I'm a game developer, and maybe if I can earn some money from it, that's a bonus as well. But I'm not going to be purely focusing on I'm gonna make my magnum opus. I know there's a lot of you guys who are oh, just make the game you wanna make. That's fine, but this is not the video for you then. So keep that in mind that depending on if you're a great artist or you're a great programmer, some of these things may differ a little bit, but other things will stay the same. The first thing that will probably stay the same for the most part is your game's scope. What are you going to make? And if I'm a solo developer, I would be looking at bang for the buck genres, basically. This is something where I have more replayability, I can reuse certain mechanics, whereas if you make a narrative-focused, story-based game, every level you make is basically played once, someone walks through it in 5 minutes and that's it. Going for something more sandboxy or more something like roguelites and things like that, survivor-likes, I think those are better in terms of rapidly being able to create content and create a game that you can play multiple times and you can keep playing for longer. Because if you make a 30-minute long game, you're probably not going to be able to charge money for it. So I would probably go for more of a city builder approach, sandboxy approach with things for example, Townscaper, Summer House, Bridges and Docks by Thomas Stewart, who's also another YouTube dev. Those would be the games that I would want to go for. And I would look for something that I think realistically I could do in 3 months, but because I'm a solo developer, if I can do it in 9 months, realistically at the end of the day, I think that's a win already. But find something where, the exact mechanics aren't too crazy, but there's something unique still to your game. But it doesn't have to be all crazy. I've made a video a while back where I talked about some of the game ideas that I would make if I had more time and skill. I talk about some of the ideas that I think could be a good fit here as well. Another genre you could go for, this is something that Crisostomo talks a lot about as well, is that how every game developer should make a horror game. I think that is also something that you could go for. I don't like horror, so that wouldn't be the genre I go for, but the advantages here is horror games can be pretty scuffed because it's always so dark usually, your level design shouldn't be too crazy. And horror games are expected to be shorter in length. You do not need to make an 8-hour horror game. If you have a horror game that's 1 to 2 hours, that's fine already. There's plenty of massively successful horror games that are you play it for 1 to 2 hours and that's it. And also in terms of marketing, especially if you go for mascot horror games, they're easier to market. Of course, there's getting more competition as well, but that's the case for every genre on Steam. That is something you can consider as well. Whatever you do, there are a few things that I want you to keep in mind, because there are so many other genres you could take if you want. Ideally, go for something that is not multiplayer. That's step 1, because who are you going to test it with? Sure, you can have a second instance of the game open, but testing it is going to be too hard. Also, multiplayer just adds extra scope creep and things like that, so I wouldn't go for that if I could. Also remember that games are huge at the end of the day, so even if you think you have a small scope, you're probably going to go way out of the water with it. So try and start small at least, and don't go immediately for an RPG, because that's just dumb. Don't go for giant scale open world games either. I think that's not the best move unless you have a lot of sandboxing and replayability elements in it. And lastly, this is especially important if you're a solo developer, go with something that you like the genre and you have affinity with. When you're making games in a team, this is a bit, not everyone is gonna love the same genres as much. And it's like, fine, it's a job for us at the end of the day, so we can deal with that. If you're a solo developer, you better have a good understanding of the game you want to make and just find the game that you're making fun, because it's gonna be extra hard to stay motivated. I'll talk more about that in a second. Now that you have gotten that idea, the great question that every game developer asks is, what engine should you go for? Keep in mind, I'm like a 5 out of 10 programmer at most. I could probably learn relatively quickly because there used to be a time where I was more of a programmer. I would go for Unreal Engine, is my guess, because I think Unity could work as well if you are more of a programmer. Like you already know how to program C for like your day job or whatever. I think Unity is great then. Blueprints is something that looks more appealing to me. Honestly, still Unreal and Unity are my main suggestions just because of the fact that they have giant marketplaces, they have giant knowledge bases. Whereas yeah, Godot is like licensing is better, it's open source, whatever. But there's just not as much support for it yet in terms of assets, code samples, things like shaders, things like just looking at how do previous games work. I would go for those engines. Don't overcomplicate this. If you are not a programmer at all, go for Game Maker Studio, I think. But the problem there is that you're more tied to 2D games, which from a marketing perspective aren't always the best. And speaking of the art style, this is the next one. I think there's only like 1 or 2 good options really if you want to make a game in that short period of time. Either you want to go for like highly realistic PBR art, so basically it looks like real life, or I would go for a like very low poly, basically Cinti asset stylized 3D, because these also give you the most flexibility. I know Cinti gets a bad rep, but at the end of the day, we also did surveys on like, what is your primary skill? Most of you guys are programmers, so that's why I'm sticking to this. 3D art takes a long time to make, takes a long time to make good, and you just want to make a game probably. You don't want to make just assets. Going for either of those two styles gives you the most flexibility of, okay, what exactly do I want to make? Especially with Unreal, you got like all of the Megascan stuff. With Unity and like Cinti and whatever, yes, maybe you think like, oh, this looks generic. The only reason Cinti looks generic and so recognizable is because there's like no post-processing, there's no shaders, there's nothing on top of it. It's just the default Unity lighting with the Cinti asset packs thrown into it, and that's it. The advantage Cinti has is because it's so commonly used and it has such a distinct style almost. You can mix of like sci-fi packs, fantasy packs, whatever. There's so many assets out there, it's kind of crazy at the end of the day. That's the reason why there are plenty of great looking games made with Cinti assets where people don't really care just because it has good post-processing, it has good shading and whatever. I would focus more on that, on like the technical art, even though I have once again no real clue yet how that works, things like shaders and those post-processing, versus actually making bespoke custom 3D models. Because at the end of the day, the shading and the lighting and all of those effects are going to do more for how does the game look overall than you spending time on like making your own low poly trash can or whatever. Also, for anything else like music, icons, whatever, just use assets, go for assets as much as you can. That's really all I can say, because once again, keep in mind, you're a solo developer, you only have so many hours a day realistically where you can work on your game, and if you want to ship something in a relatively short period of like 1 year at most, well, you're going to have to do that. And then the last thing where I would be extremely vigilant about is focusing only on what matters to the game. Scope creep, it's a thing, we've talked about it before, but especially it can be a trap for a lot of solo devs to look at what other games are doing that are not developed by solo developers, look at that and be like, okay, my game needs to have all of that as well, even though they forget that, hey, that's not realistic. Things like, hey, I'm gonna localize my game into 17 different languages or whatever, because this other company, they work together with a localization company, they have all these countries. No, just make your game in English, and if you have like post-launch support for language or whatever, that's fine, but I really would urge you to just focus on being able to release that thing already, because once again, releasing teaches you so much as well. Other things that probably don't matter as much depending on like the genre, of course, is things like, oh, I need to have full controller support, and then lead up to, oh yeah, I'm also gonna port to Switch and PlayStation and Xbox because they also have pretty good indie programs now. Don't do that. Focus on one platform. And even then, if you're focusing only on Steam, my advice is don't even focus with things like macOS and Linux. I know the 12 Linux viewers are now very offended, but the data doesn't lie. We can see the wishlist counts per platform. And basically 99% of our entire Forge Industry audience is playing on Windows. And we had Mac support, but it was not worth it. We just did it because one of our developers used the Mac. Don't bother with it. Also things like Proton, generally pretty good. These are big traps for solo developers. Don't focus on it. Focus on the game and not the fact that, hey, I could sell 3 more copies if I port this to Linux, because first of all, if you don't have a game to port to begin with, well, there's not really a point in it. So those are the main things I would do differently. But there's also a lot that I've learned from working in a team that I would probably stick to. First, very important one is use version control. You don't even have to put your code on GitHub or whatever. If you're solo, you can just have a completely local Git repository. The goal is just to be able to actually structure your commits, be able to roll back without losing all of your progress. And ideally, yeah, if you can put it on GitHub or whatever, it's going to help with just making sure that, hey, losing your hard drive doesn't mean you're going to lose your game. Do things like backups, of course, but version control, very important. Other thing that kind of ties into the version control, because we use the same platform for it, GitLab, is project management. I know it sounds dumb, and we probably do it a little bit too extreme versus what I would do solo, but things like, for example, Trello or any other Kanban-based system of this is all of the stuff I need to do, this is what I'm working on right now, these are my bugs, and this is what I've finished, is extremely important for knowing what are you actually going to work on. So I would also very much urge you to stick doing that. Like whether you're in a team or you're solo, like the complexity will probably be not as big if you're a solo dev, because you don't need to do things like assignments and merge requests and all that stuff, but still have something to track what are you doing. Something else that doesn't really change whether you're solo or in the team is marketing. You don't have a dedicated PR person on your team anyway. I've made videos about marketing before, so do it, don't forget it. Don't just focus purely on the game. I know I said that earlier, like, hey, porting and localization. Marketing is different. Always market your game, because otherwise, once again, remember the goal at the beginning was that people do still actually have interest in this game. They want to buy it, so put some effort into that. Another thing, and this is something that I would want you to be wary of. I know, I always call you my lovely AI bros who are like, hey, AI is going to make my entire game and I don't have to worry too much about that. I'll get Suno AI for the music, I'll get Midjourney for the icons, whatever. Sure thing, buddy, but I think your game's gonna suck still. I'm sorry. I would, if you can, stay away from like using AI for everything in your game to make the assets and everything. I know like every 2 days, basically, I get like a text to 3D model sponsor in my inbox of like, hey, I wanna make a like sponsor your channel. We don't take those because I think it's not good. It's simply not there yet. It needs more time in the oven and it's not going to be anytime soon yet. We're like at like 80% of their production ready. The problem is it's like developing a game. After you've done the first 80%, you still have another 80% to go before it's actually complete. And these AI tools, they have the same problem. It's like acceptable-ish, but it's not really good enough. And also they're kind of expensive still. So I don't think it's worth it. At that point, just get some good asset packs instead and stick to those. And then the last thing that I would do, or like not really change or kind of change, and this is probably the most important thing, so I hope you stuck around until now, is even if I was solo, I would see that I don't have to be alone. That is an important difference. Like, I don't need someone to join me on my project, because it honestly, rev shares, they go wrong 95% of the time, I feel. I don't want to do that. I would stick to being a solo developer, but I would look into finding someone called an accountability buddy, whatever you want to call it. We have a great Discord server. This is the point where I'm going to shout out my own Discord server. And in there are like people who are like, hey, I'm working on my game, but I just want someone to keep me accountable. Make sure that I keep working on my game. Because sure, you're going to start that first week, that first 2 weeks, everything's going great, everything's hyped, you're making progress on developing your game, but at some point things will go wrong and you just need someone who's like, you need to work on your fucking game right now. And this is honestly the most important thing I think you can have as a solo developer, because you need someone who just pushes you through, who makes sure that, hey, you keep working on your game and you don't just flail around and the game ends up being another scrap project, after which you'll move on to a new project to once again never complete. Finding that is very important, I think. Head to the link in the description down below. There's our Discord server link there. Join it, and just there's like a channel called Looking for Partners. Send a message, and there are a lot of people in there who are already doing that like accountability buddy system. I think it's a really solid thing, and you should do it as well. So at the end of the day, I think I'm still very lucky that the rest of the team has not been hit by a train, but I think this was still an interesting thing to realize that, hey, if I actually had to make games, how screwed would I be? I know there's like so many approaches to game development. This is just what I would do. Maybe you think that I'm a soulless corporate drone who just wants to do like optimally market research games and make that. That's up to you. But apart from that, if you're new here, we're game developers, like we're a team of them. I'm not solo, luckily. Oh yeah, that's maybe one more thing. I would drop YouTube. If I was solo developer, it's not a good return on investment. If I would do it, I would do like once every week or something, and it would be very scuffed, like 10 minutes of, hey, this is what I learned. But I would massively drop the amount of effort. Don't do YouTube if you're a solo developer. It's not worth it. You're not going to get a good return on investment for it. That's my bonus tip. But anyways, if you're new here, like I said, if you could do me a favor and head down below and subscribe. We upload 2 videos every week. We do a bunch of live streams and things like that. So if you're interested in just learning more about game development, I think there's a lot of great content on this channel. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!